So just try to keep it formal. And normally, this is I don't even set any questions, but with you, what I wanted to do is just talk about the background to this whole thing, more from the perspective of people who don't know a lot about it. I find a lot of us we all talk together in such a way it's almost like a jargon. It's all about subjects that are well known and well traversed, and that's interesting to me and interesting to you, but maybe not to to people that have no idea about it. And I'd like to reach those guys tonight a little bit. Now remember that I sent my questions over to you, so just to fill you out from the beginning and get that background. And those who know would have heard of me before, but what started the Nessie craze? Was there a trigger moment, or why did you get interested?
Well, what started the Nessie craze? I think there's probably multiple factors here. It's probably hard to pick out one, because if you take it away, the rest may not have happened. But we certainly go back to the 1930s. I think it's important to state what the backdrop was to Britain at that time, where when the Great Depression in 1933, things were pretty low in Britain. There was trouble over on the continent with Hitler rearming, and people were high levels of unemployment and so on. People feeling a bit down, and I think in some regards people were looking for a feel-good story. So the media, I'm talking now about the media.
Yeah.
The newspapers of the time picked up on this story. It all began locally, and there's concentric ripples here. Back in 1933, the government had set people to work, basically building bridges, roads, dams, and so on, hydroelectric schemes. So there was a lot of activity going up to the highlands to put people back to work during this economic crash. A bit like today, but it's probably worse actually. And because there's less welfare, for example. So they were building a road up the north shore of Loch Ness. Now this is purely economical, to connect towns like Inverness to central Scotland, Glasgow, Edinburgh, so on. So as an economic project, they began to cut down trees along the side of Loch Ness. I have to point out there was already a road there. There'd always been a road on the north side of Loch Ness. This was an improvement. They were clearing it, they're widening it, improving the surface and so on. And this opened up the loch to tourism and such like. And at that time, you probably had the best views of the loch ever. If you look at postcards all the time, you hardly see a tree in sight. They just cut them all down. So this is the north shore. The south shore was a bit different. It was more underdeveloped. So against this backdrop, which encouraged some tourism to start up, people had easier access to the highlands. We have this newspaper story that appeared in the local newspaper called the Inverness Courier, and one of the local correspondents had a story published on the 2nd of May 1933 called "Strange Spectacle on Loch Ness." And that story, that write-up began with Loch Ness has for generations been credited with being the home of a fearsome-looking monster, and it asked the question, has this legendary water kelpie been seen? And it relates not the story of a tourist, but of a lady who was at that time anonymous. It just talks about a well-known businessman and his wife travelling along the North Shore towards Mirages, which is one of the northernmost villages. And they saw what they thought was a disturbance in the water, as if it was ducks fighting. But then they said they noticed this creature, almost like a whale, disporting itself, rolling and plunging for about a minute. They said the body resembled that of a whale. They weren't saying it was the size of a whale, but rather the skin and the appearance. Water cascading, and it disappeared in a boiling mass of foam. So this story got published. I have to point out there had been some stories published before in 1930 in a couple of Highland newspapers. But that didn't seem to take off. Now, as it turned out, the witnesses were Aldi Mackay and her husband. Now, it turns out that Aldi Mackay saw most of it because her husband was driving. Now, Aldi Mackay was very well versed with the loch. She was a salmon fisher, angler. She knew the moods and appearances of the loch. So she said it's a monster, because she said that because it had always been a local tradition of a monster in the loch. And this story came out, and it was fleshed out some later in the year by a researcher called Rupert T. Gould, who wrote the first book on the Loch Ness Monster. He went up and interviewed her, and the story pretty much tallied with the original press story. So that kicked things off. But at that point, it was still very much a kind of local highland story. But I say that because the story never got beyond the Inverness Courier. It wasn't picked up by the leading Scottish newspapers like the Herald or the Scotsman. So that started it, and following on from that, we have a series of reports of similar strange sights in the loch being reported by the Courier, and as it grew to other Highland newspapers. So it remained in that domain until about the summer, late in the summer. Aldi Mackay's sighting was probably around late March, April, and it got finally published in May, as I said. But what really kicked things off was in July 1933, a man and his wife called George Spicer. Now, George Spicer was just a tourist. He lived in London. He ran a Savile Row tailor outlet. He was a director of that company, and they were just motoring down the other side of the loch, on the south side, between the villages of Doors and Foyers. So a little bit in the area of another village called Whitefield. And he says he actually, once again, Inverness Courier picked up this story because he basically wrote a letter to them, and the editor felt obliged to prepare people for the shock of this story by saying, well, perhaps he just saw a line of otters or something like that. Yeah. So they tried to balance what they felt was sensationalism in the story, because basically he said he saw this huge creature lumbering across them in front of the road. His original letter basically said, I returned from a motoring holiday, and he went to inform them on the 22nd of July. He saw the nearest approach to a dragon or a prehistoric monster he had ever seen in his life crossing the road. But I said it had a long neck which moved up and down like a snake railway, like a undulating. Body big, high back. You couldn't see any feet or flippers or webbed because of the brow of the hill, and he wasn't sure about any tail. It moved so rapidly, very ugly, he said. At the time, he put its length at about 6 to 8 feet long. So later, Rupert Gould once again interviewed them as well for his book, and when Gould told them that the width of the road was 14 feet, he said, "Oh well, I've underestimated the size of the creature."
Okay.
And he put it above 20 feet, 25 feet long. Now, how he came back to calculation, I'm not sure, but did he include an imaginary tail or something like that? So that story was published once again beginning of August 1963. But this time the story was picked up by national newspapers. So the Scotsman and others, London newspapers, began to pick it up, the Times and that. So what happened was, after that, the Scotsman, I think, took the lead in this story. The Inverness Courier continued to report on sightings, but the Scotsman sent up a correspondent to investigate the matter, and he went up to Fort Augustus and other areas and began to interview, take notes, drawings, sketches of what was going on up here. And they ran a long article around September 1933, so we're talking about weeks later. This published article, which includes sightings which have gone into the mainstream of the eyewitness database. A lot of them were describing humps, some long necks and humps at the same time. Alex Campbell, who was actually the correspondent who reported the first Aldi Mackay story, he recounted his story to the correspondent anonymously. We think that because he was a water bailiff and he worked for the fishery or the Lovett estate. We're not clear who he exactly worked for. So he was a bit careful not to get too incredulous with his stories. He reported his anonymity, so did others, and that was picked up. It was like a cascade effect now. Inverness Courier, Scotsman, Herald, went down to London Times, Daily Sketch, Daily Mail. So then it began to just ripple out to beyond. But then other sightings came in. But then by this time, Bernard Marmaduke Wetherell, a big game hunter, had been commissioned by the Daily Mail. So the Daily Mail now got in the act. This is around December. We now moved a couple of months on to December. Daily Mail set up Marmaduke Wetherell to write a series, to report back a series of articles on his, shall we call it, an expedition. And as that became a bit of not a scandal position, but became a bit of a joke. The Daily Mail, I'm not sure how seriously they took it, but to this day the Daily Mail has continuously reported Loch Ness Monster. And Wetherell found some four-toed tracks almost within a few days of arriving.
Yes.
And he declared that the monster tracks have been found, and it is a four-toed amphibian. And they took plaster casts of these tracks and sent them down to the Natural History Museum in London, who within a couple of weeks came back and declared them to be the tracks of a hippopotamus, probably a female, and that the tracks were all of the same foot, not left, right, forward, or back. So at the time, no one pointed the finger at Wetherell, who was actually turned out to be they blamed it on a local wag who must have had something like an umbrella with a hippo foot on it.
Yeah.
He'd gone around stamping footprints all over the place. But actually, the beach where they found the tracks was only accessible by boat. So we don't think that even back then the work of a local was a bit suspect. Marmaduke Wetherell, we'll come back to him later because the stories came in were then the Arthur Grant land sighting. We had a young man called Arthur Grant on around January the 5th into 1934 now. So we're talking about weeks later. He claimed he saw something that looked like a hybrid between a plesiosaur and a seal. That looks like, but this is about 1 a.m. under a full moon light, clear sky. He said he saw this creature take cross once again near a breaking near the site of the Aldi Mackay. So he took 2 bounds across the loch and plunged into the water. So he described this thing as having what he saw a long neck, front webbed feet, back, a bulbous body with a sign of a tail, but he wasn't sure about any rear legs because of the lighting conditions. Marmaduke Wetherell came up and investigated the site with him, and once again they found some tracks. But what happened to these tracks, we have no idea. There's no report on them. I think by then maybe the Natural History Museum was a bit fed up with plastic casts. But actually tracks were found by third-party groups. There was a group from my city of Edinburgh who came up to investigate. And they who were coincidentally there at the time, went to investigate the Arthur Grant beach. And they said they said they found skid marks and other depressions which are reminiscent of a large animal crossing. I mean, some people think Grant and Weatherall were in on it together. I don't accept that theory, especially when we have this third-party verification of what was going on. So, I mean, the world of Bigfoot tracks are the big thing, aren't they? They always like to find
That's right.
tracks.
Yes.
In
Yes.
the case of Loch Ness Monster, we only have one or two ever recorded instances of strange unknown tracks, and this is basically down to the beach. It's not sandy enough; it's too pebbly.
I wondered about that. Yeah.
So it's and things reached a peak, kind of peak Nessie in 1934 with the surgeon's photograph. This is the most famous, iconic image of the monster.
That's right.
We have the image of the long neck, the long graceful neck and the head, looking towards the left of the picture. This was allegedly taken by a Harley Street surgeon called Robert Kenneth Wilson. The Daily Mail picked that one up. They bought his picture, and that basically led to droves of people sweeping up to the loch in the summer of 1934. And by the time 1934 has passed, we've had hundreds of sightings. Not all of them could have been of a monster. 1934 was the year in which the most sightings of eyewitness reports were recorded. No one comes near 1934. And then things just crashed. The press lost interest. There are still stories coming through the Courier and all the mainstream media, but it had its day. There'd been a media storm. Weatherall and the Daily Mail had concluded it was just a giant seal and I think they made up a sighting that they saw a seal. And as the Second World War approached, and people had more important things to consider, the monster faded from view. But the craze, May 1933 to about July 1934, peak Nessie in some sense. That's how the craze started.
Well, I think it's especially to get your learning perspective on it. For me, it's really, really fascinating. And you mentioned the surgeon Wilson, the Harley Street surgeon. I worked in Harley Street for 7 years, and it always fascinated me that a person that worked in that environment would come out with such a sighting, would be so bold as to publish such a sighting, because the damage to reputation could be really significant, even today. And I wondered, is it one of these cases that you have with witnesses sometimes where they cannot unsee what they've seen, and so regardless of the consequence, they speak? With this particular one, I know there's a lot of controversy surrounding rumours of a cover-up for an affair. Well, to me, that seems the worst possible excuse you could think of. And this light revenge against the Daily Mail on behalf of Marmaduke Weatherall that some people espouse as well. I mean, what's your take on the surgeon's photo sighting? Of course, the what's called the deathbed confession, which isn't a deathbed confession as well, about the hoax. Go into that a little bit, because I think I read one of your blogs about that. I was very, very interested in it.
Yeah, I mean, the surgeon's photograph was signing quite an iconic image for about 60 years thereafter. Every major monster hunter uses it in their book, and they try to see hidden features in it. And some people claim to see whiskers on the head, the muzzle and so on. But it's most likely a hoax. Back in 1975, Adrian Shine, who's one of the experts, was put in contact, was given a newspaper clipping this claim that hoax, and that they should talk to the son of Marmaduke Weatherall, who was Ian Weatherall. I think he died by then. By the time they got on to investigating this later in the 1980s, he had died. But the investigators, Alistair Boyd and David Martin, who exposed this, got in touch with the stepson of Marmaduke Wetherell, called Christian Spurling, who lived in Twickenham in London. By now he's by then, when they found him and he was willing to speak to them, he was in his early 90s, I think. So he said it was all a hoax, that it had been a revenge act for the Daily Mail sacking Bernard Wetherell. So, and Wetherell set up a chain of command, whatever, front man, middleman. Spurling was a middleman who fashioned the model out of plastic wood and put it on a wooden base and stabilised it with lead weights, tested it on his pond in the back garden. They took it up north, took some pictures, which were developed in Inverness. Some people claim that the negatives were taken back to Conspiracy HQ and were re-photographed. Either way, there were only 2 photographs came out, the famous one and the one which Wilson, who was the front man, they wanted some respectful personality to bring forward the picture, to give it credence. And Wilson was a bit of a practical joker. He was always up for a laugh. So he was a front man. Anonymous. He was initially anonymous, but his name came out eventually. The Daily Mail, that's exactly what Wetherell wanted, took the picture. The only mystery is, why didn't Marmaduke Wetherell follow through and confess the hoax and scandalise the Daily Mail? So that never happened. That's an ink blot on the theory. But Spurling, we have 2 confessions. We have Christian Spurling saying it's all a hoax and I made the model, and we have the newspaper clipping from 1975 in which Ian Wetherell, Marmaduke's son, confesses. And we also have to add to the give weight to that theory, Ian Wetherell's son, who's still alive today, showed Martin embroiled the ashtray which had been used to produce the hippopotamus fake tracks. So this proved that Wetherell was a faker, and it wasn't beyond the bounds of imagination to see him producing a fake photograph. So it's a fake. I mean, some people have questions. Is a hoax?
I know, and with all these things, Roland, I mean, we've all been on the forums, and largely it becomes a subject of belief, and I myself have been in that position in the past where your belief or desire for the reality of evidence or a subject becomes overwhelming to the point where it's hard to accept clear facts that contradict it. And I think that's something that's come to interest me more in cryptozoology in recent years, actually. The pseudo-religious aspect of people's interest in it, which is very strange. Talking about that kind of thing, how did you first get interested in Nessie? Was it these particular finding these particular clips on you, or was it looking at things like the In Search Of series in the 1970s with Leonard Nimoy and others? How did you get involved?
Yeah, well, it certainly wasn't religious. It was because I lived in Scotland. I had an interest in mysteries anyway. I had an interest in UFOs, Bigfoot. I mean, UFOs to me were alien vehicles and things like that. But I was also interested in dinosaurs, and I liked drawing dinosaurs. I mean, I was too young to remember the famous Flipper photograph in 1972.
Yeah.
But when I was still at school, I picked up a book called The Story of Loch Ness Monster by Tim Dinsdale, and that was written for kids like me. So a small paperback, basically an introduction to something, and I got me hooked. I began to buy up other books like Tim Dinsdale's larger works, an author called Ted Holliday, and Peter Costello, who wrote on Loch Ness Monster and other lake monsters throughout the world. And by then, back in 1975, I was still at school. The famous Rhine's underwater photographs were being made public, and I was avidly following this. He set an expedition under the umbrella organisation Academy of Applied Science, which were based in New York, I think, and they went over underwater cameras and sonar, set up rigs which would be ostensibly suspended in mid-water, with a sonar transducer giving an indication of any objects in the area. And basically several photographs were taken, one the famous gargoyle head, and the other, there were two famous photographs of gargoyle head, one showing what looks like a long-necked bulbous body. So, I mean, by then I was hooked on the monster, and this just confirmed my view. Though at the time I was a bit sceptical about the gargoyle head, because I was pretty familiar with the sightings by now, and most people didn't describe a gargoyle head, so I was dubious about that one. I mean, most people say that the head is so small it looks like a continuation of the neck.
Yeah, I've noticed that with a lot of sightings. Almost, you don't really notice it's a head until it levels out, or it turns, almost.
Yeah, the head is pretty small. I mean, for people interested, I mean, the monster it looks like a plesiosaur. It has a bulbous middle body, 4 flippers or webbed feet, has a tail, a tapering tail, which is almost as long as the body. And you have a long neck and small head, which is almost again as long as the body. So you have a kind of monster that would be cut into 3 sections of equal length: tail, body, and neck. And normally people would just say something about 30 foot long, going up to over 40 feet. Some people claim they've seen a monster 50 feet plus, but generally 20 to 30 feet long. So in my mind, I'd already. That's why people thought it was a plesiosaur. But at the time, people thought this confirmed the plesiosaur theory, because they had this bulbous body and this grainy underwater picture of a long neck, which I still accept as likely as a picture of the monster, although I do not accept the head. So I got interested in that. I bought all the books. I went through my mind, what could it be? I eventually got up to Loch when I was a student in the 1980s. Cycling holidays. I've still got the logbook in my bookcase. My entry day 4, day 1, went there, did this, visited
That'd be
this
amazing.
person.
Awesome.
And but by the time I gone through university and got a career, I'm a software engineer. I was still interested. I watched the newspapers, but then we didn't have the internet by then, so the only way I could keep up was reading newspapers.
That's fine.
So by then, I got married, had kids, and life overtook me. And it wasn't until 10 years ago, a turn of the century, turn of the millennium, late night, around the year 2000, when the kids were still young then, but I'd had enough time to. I just got diverted. I looked at all the Nessie forums, or the bulletin boards, or the news groups back then. I was largely sceptical, largely scared.
Yeah.
So I thought, I need to counterbalance this.
Yeah.
So I started.
Yeah.
I started arguing on blogs like the Nessie.com website. Used to have a forum called Nessie's Dashboard. It's gone now. But 20 years ago I was on that as a young man, arguing the case for Nessie, as were others, but others were becoming dubious. But then I thought, there's really not enough of an internet presence for the monster, so I started my blog 10 years ago this month, actually.
Wow. And it's, I mean, just for anybody listening at the Loch Ness Mystery blog, it's extensive. I've been through it back and forth, and it's a huge work, Roland. A huge body of work.
Yes, 700 articles. Some are just one-liners, but I've gone through these phases. I've tried to dig up the past and find new witnesses, talk to old witnesses, find photographs that have never been published before, and obviously follow new sightings, and at the same time take on skepticism, because a lot of the monster hunters of the past are now the skeptics of the present.
Yeah.
And
isn't that funny how that happens?
A few of them are quite evangelical about dismissing the monster. I mean, you think if they didn't stop believing and just walk away and go and do something useful, like
I think that was the question I
hill
posed
walking or something.
An old foe of yours we won't mention. I think that's the question I posed to him after a big line of communication. Said, well, you know, you've been there for 6 decades. You concluded this maybe 3-4 decades ago. What are you still doing there? The answer was quite common sense. It's a nice area to live in, and I work around the loch, so well, that's fair enough. But why are you still interested if you haven't been interested in seeing it as a reality for this length of time? What do you think? Where do you think evangelical skepticism comes from? I mean, for a long-term investment, we can be skeptical, but to be evangelical about it, surely we must have it that itself centers around a belief that we want to spread. We want to tell people you're wrong about this, or actually you're all mistaken, and I need to spread the word. Where do you think that comes from?
I think, first of all, it's a part of a wider movement of skepticism. I mean, we're living in the age of skepticism where anything without hard evidence is poo-pooed or even attacked, from religion, Bigfoots, flying saucers. So people like Loch Ness skeptics have just plugged themselves into this network. Okay. So they're part of a larger community, which brings some kudos and respect, I guess. But the other aspect, I think, is it's a bit like the reformed alcoholic to me. You have the alcohol or smokers. So when somebody gives up smoking, not everyone, or they give up alcoholism, then they become evangelical. They tell people you must never touch a drop of the stuff, or something like that. They just go completely to the other side. So they don't just say, "Oh, I'm so glad I've given up." Drink, and they just go off and leave a normal life.
So
some people.
Yeah, that's what it is. Now I found out the real truth about this. I've got to make sure that none of the rest of you fall into the same trap.
Yeah.
Funnily enough,
some people actually think. Some people think cryptozoology is actually dangerous, and they have to stop it.
Well, that's strange to me, really, because in its very basic elements, what are we talking about? The search for hidden animals. You're finding new species of frogs and bats and snakes all the time, actually, in well-explored countries. They found that new salamander in Florida recently. And, I mean, how well explored is Florida? I mean, it's a vast area, but there's been an eye on Florida for a long time, a very scientific eye. And yet, new salamander, it's about 1.5 feet long or whatever the length is. It's not a tiny creature. And there it is, right under their nose. They never saw it. So, I always think about things like that. The billy ape. 6 foot tall. Yeah. It's a huge ape. We didn't know about it until very recent times. So, I mean, talking about that kind of thing, then talking about the skeptics and everything else that goes into this genre, I think it would be probably good to go into the eDNA study, and your opinions on that. Anyway, just to preface, I think it's a fantastic science, but are we, before your opinion, are we in a position these days where we look at things like the sonar study of the loch, or several samples around the loch as being conclusive of the entirety of the body of water? Is that the position that we're in, really, as laymen? And what do you think the true scientific overview of that particular study is? What did they really capture, and what's left to find?
Yeah, so environmental DNA it's not a new subject, but it's becoming more important in tracking animals and their presence, their populations, their survivability. They basically take up DNA fragments of animals from the waters which have been discharged or shed or other things, and they take them to labs and they'll multiply them up, and then they'll sequence the DNA, and then they'll match those sequences against known species. They're basically running big computer programs which are try to slot these Loch Ness segments into known segments of. So it's a bit like pattern matching, you know. So what is the best fitting match? So back in 2012, when I was writing on the difficulty of finding a Nessie carcass, and I said, well, the next best thing is to go down there and do eDNA study. So I was suggesting it back in 2012. Eventually, Neil Gemmell, the professor on the study, he was recommended to do it by Darren Nash, who's a skeptic, but skeptics believe in science. So do I. So the job was done back in June a year or two ago, and basically it's pretty accurate. They found just about everything they could find in the loch, but some things they didn't find. They didn't find otters, for example. They didn't find any otter DNA. So the thing is, nobody's saying it's perfect, but it's as good as you're going to get, I think. So they found the stuff like eels. They weren't going to find seals, for example, because they're just occasional visitors. And we talked about the DNA has to be continuously replenished through shedding and defecation, because the DNA degrades after a number of weeks. So if a seal comes in and goes out again 10 weeks before Neil Gemmell came, it wouldn't have found anything. The other problem is if something is too localized, like otters, then if they're not sampling in the right area, I think they took 200 samples areas. Otters don't go into the middle of the loch, as far as I know. They just hide along the shoreline. So anything along the shoreline, and certainly Cardiff is not going to be found. So they didn't find otters. I think there's one or two other things they didn't find. They found human DNA, of course, by various birds. I mean, I wouldn't say they found every waterfowl. So it's a good technique for finding and verifying what's there. I don't think it's so good at telling us about proportions. I don't think it's so good at telling us about abundance of life, or I don't think you can map it to a biomass, for example. No. But they found lots of eel DNA. So that which revives an old view that there's millions of eels in Loch Ness. And I had an old paper clipping from the 60s rather, talking about millions of elvers, glass eels being caught in Loch Ness to be sent to Eastern Europe for raising and eating. So others have said, and Tim Denton and others said, there's millions of eels that could provide food for a larger predator. So at the end of the day, they didn't plesiosaur or DNA. Nobody knows what plesiosaur or DNA looks like, but they can make a rough approximation to turtles or other living creatures. They didn't find any reptile basing it and any kind of reptiles, even the little ones. And there's a lot of unknown DNA as well. I mean, I think they said that a good proportion, 30-40%, they could not pattern match against anything. So I mean,
could that be down to poor sampling or contaminated sampling, probably?
Yeah, it's down to fragments being too small.
That's what I thought. And a lot of people read into that to say they just couldn't identify it. But I think they couldn't run it, is what they were saying.
Well, if the sequence of DNA is too small, then you're going to get multiple matches.
Mm.
You're going to get ambiguity.
Exactly.
The longer the sequence, the more of a unique match you're going to get. And Neil Gemmell at some point will publish a scientific paper, and we'll get access to all this data.
Yeah.
He said that others are free to run sequences against their own databases. But obviously only a professional could do that.
I mean, the cost is prohibitive.
For people like us. So, obviously at the end of the day, he said that giant eel theory is not inconsistent with his findings.
Mm.
And the giant eel theory took off and people started chatting about it. And the funny thing was, a day or two before he went public with his findings, there was a video in the River Ness on this long eel-like object.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
flitting through the water. I mean, it wasn't Nessie size
or something. Yeah,
but it looks pretty big.
Yeah,
eels can get pretty big, but no one's ever caught an eel more than about 3 foot long in Loch Ness.
Yeah.
But they found moray eels and conger eels out in the sea, close to the North Sea. But I know if someone had fished out an eel 6 foot long in Loch Ness, we would have known about it.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be fishing them out because they're voracious predators. You know, they wouldn't be those big, boisterous animals would be getting caught.
I mean, the only we may not catch them is if your line isn't set up for them, because a 6 footer is. People are normally just if you're fishing for a salmon. A 1 foot salmon, a fairly large salmon, and your line should be able to catch a 6 foot eel. No one ever had. So if there's no 6 footers, you never catch a 20 footer. No. We'd expect gradation of sizes if it's a giant eel. Yeah, but we don't. So
but then there's the morphology issue, isn't there? I mean, you talk about this a lot. I know. If they are giant eels, well, what about the head and neck sightings and the bulbous body and the flippers and everything else? Everybody else. There was something you talk about a bit in your book, and I've used it in so many interviews and referenced you on this to say you talk about my argument sucks or my theory sucks the least theory, which is sure an eel couldn't morphologically exhibit those behaviors that this long-necked, bulbous-bodied, full-flippered beast seems to, but it beats the theory that as some prehistoric survivors living in a cold loch in Scotland. I like that because I say, well, actually, the skeptical theory in that instance is much worse than the plausible reality that there could be some living prehistoric creature somewhere.
Yeah, it's down to use Occam's razor as kind of guide. Occam's razors you could have a genuine 40 footer on the loch, but Occam razors that can still exclude it from every explanation. I mean, the Aldi Mackay sighting. I mean, the skeptics kind of view. Well, my theory sucks the least because it may be stupid, but it's not incredible, like a plesiosaur theory. For example, the Aldi Mackay sighting, she saw 2 humps moving around. So one skeptic said, she just saw 2 seals in a mating ritual. So you say, okay, that sounds rational, logical. Yeah. So why do we need to believe in monsters? I mean, why can't we just accept that theory? So the tactic is to dumb down the explanation, come in with something which sounds half plausible and everyone's happy. But then the problem is you begin to pick away at it. You realise that she saw it in March, April, and that's not the mating season for seals, for example. And she said she watched the area for half an hour, and seals will normally come back up after 8 minutes because they're air breathers. So it wasn't. No one recorded. I mean, no one saw seals in Loch Ness in 1933. We'd have known about them. I mean, seals get shot all the time in Loch Ness. And they're very inquisitive creatures, curiosity, they follow boats. I mean, if there was a seal in Loch Ness in 1933, we'd have known about it. So when I go back to the other theories, I mean, try to fit the Loch Ness Monster is like having just a few jigsaw puzzle pieces, and you're not quite sure how to fit them all together. It's like the blind men and the elephant, because the one's touching the trunk and says it's a snake, the other's touching the tail and says this one's touching its trunk-like legs and saying, well, this is a tree, and so
I like that. Yeah.
No one ever sees the monster in its entirety apart from these very rare land sightings. Yeah. When you see it in the water, you either see its back, or you see its neck. The tail is rarely seen. It's a jigsaw.
When talking about the land sightings, obviously, you've written a few books on the Loch Ness Monster. Two of which I've got. I've got the water horses of Loch Ness, and I've got When Monsters Come Ashore.
Mm-hmm.
So, what to you would be three, most significant land sightings that you've heard of?
Yeah. Well, Spicer is the most important one. We've already covered that. Arthur Grant is the other one, which was basically 6 months later.
And he was a veterinarian, is that right? Or he was a student?
He was a vet.
He was a vet,
He's a student actually in Edinburgh, not far from here. So he should have known what he's looking at. And well, he should have known what the alternatives were. The other ones were, what's the next one I'd say? I like Torquil MacLeod 1960. When he was looking over from the North Shore, he looked across about a mile away to an area called the Horseshoe Scree, which is basically a scree, and he saw this. It's actually half on land, half in water, and he used his binocular reticulates to estimate it's about 50 feet long, and he watched this neck go from side to side, and he saw two front paddles, couldn't see the rear. Eventually it flopped on its side back into the water. Those are the three best ones. But we only have one photograph of the monster on as at night time, a flash, looks like a roast chicken. And we really need but I think the monster is, I mean, they only happen, they're so rare land sightings. You have more chance of winning the lottery than seeing that, even if you live in the loch. Because people try to explain away with deer, otters, mirages, and so on. I've challenged all these theories.
Mirages around the loch, is that a common phenomenon? I've not, maybe on the water, but on land?
Well, I mean, a day like today, you had mid-30s in London, centigrade.
36. Yeah. 36.
Very hot. Loch Ness would have been warm today as well. You need the tarmac to heat up. You need tarmac, black tarmac. It re-radiates the heat, and it begins to disturb the air around it. And the person, the witness, would have to be approaching, maybe possibly going down a dip or up a dip. I'm not sure the best conditions. And the object basically would be shimmered, and possibly even made to look bigger. But to be fair, I mean, mirages are not so great they can multiply up something by a factor of 3 or 4.
Yeah.
We're only talking about marginal effects. I mean, they need quite extreme mirage conditions to try and explain a lot of stuff that skeptics try to explain away. Like desert mirages or something like that. Where you have extreme temperature variation producing mirages. So mirages has never been a major theory to explain much at all because they're so rare.
Well, I mean, it's not a mirage, but perhaps what I've seen something on some of my travels to Israel, down there in the Negev desert. I've seen features that looked almost like objects or buildings or cities on the horizon, and on approaching them, they've not been there. And I suppose you could sort of call that mirage, I guess. But the haze that came along with it was there was a telltale effect to the way it looked that kind of told you it wasn't something actual. I suppose in a country like ours, people could be fooled by a mirage more easily because it would be unexpected, perhaps. But a mirage that resembles a monster crossing a
The thing
road.
is, and I've never seen a photograph of Mirage at Loch Ness. I mean,
No.
I think I saw one Mirage photograph, which was a general wide-angle shot of the entire loch. Certainly not anything that was zoomed into the kind of sizes we're talking about. So
No, I mean, absolutely not.
they're so rare they've been photographed less than the monster.
Yeah, it's reaching. Exactly, it's reaching, isn't it? Now, looking through the blog, looking through the books, everything you put together, some people might not realise that you actually do research on the loch and around the loch as well. That I believe you recently collected some game cams that you had up there for a few months. How did that go? Did you have any luck, or have you not been through them yet?
I haven't been through them yet. So I mean, so game cameras. I took this idea from Finding Bigfoot. The Bobo, his chums. They strap a camera to a tree and go away while they did other stuff. So I thought, well, that's great because monster hunting traditionally is just sitting down there on the shore, binoculars, camera, sitting there for hours waiting for something to happen. Yes, the good thing about game cameras is they have a limited range. They may have a cone of detection. We're talking about it waits for motion detection or heat detection if it's nighttime.
Mm-hmm.
So if anything moves into its field of its range, then it will take a video clip or it will take a sequence of pictures. So the good thing about that is it's only going to photograph things that are close up. So we're not talking about a Loch Ness blob here. Something that's photographed half a mile away. It's not going to take the photographs up. It may coincidentally take a picture of something half a mile away, but something moves in within its 60-foot radius, you'd be pretty sure you're going to get an unambiguous image. So, but at the same time, that significantly reduces the odds of photographing anything, because the loch is 26 square miles. One camera is covering only maybe 60 square feet, so vanishingly small. So, but I have put them along the loch. It's basically a lifelong venture. This one, when we talk about the odds here. So they snap away. So I collected. Yeah.
No. Sorry, I was just going to. Yeah, I mean, it's. I do the same thing with Bigfoot. It's worth a shot, basically, isn't it?
The odds are against you, but it's basically down to the more cameras there, the more the odds are lower. So, but the other problem is because you get a time factor as well. So you get a distance factor, 60 feet, but you also want them to be surveying the loch as long as possible. So that increases the odds of something coming in front of it. So, but the problem is, the batteries are pretty good, but the problem is it's motion, trigger motion. So sometimes the waves are crashing in. It's more an art and a science that the waves, or even sunlight, can trigger it, and it's probably related to the heat.
Because of the heat. Yeah.
So the batteries can be still primed, but the SD card fills up.
Okay.
So some of my cameras have 9,000 images on them.
Or a bunch of choppy days of waves, and the weather's often inclement up there, isn't it? It's very changeable.
Yeah. And they're used over the winter when the waters are choppier. So you've got to try and raise the camera enough to miss out the waves crashing below the shore. But if you put it too high, then you're moving the detection zone. You're moving out the cone of detection below you. So it's an art and a science. But some cameras are pretty well positioned and they only trigger and stuff goes past. So I actually looked through some of them recently, and some of them picked up canoes and boats, so they're working well. But they didn't see anything. So I've now got to go through the images of the other ones. There may be something on them, but
And
which
I'm
is a
sure
long
there's a
time.
lot of exactly. There's a lot of flicking forward, looking at waves and sunny days and the
Yeah.
rest of it. But I mean, ultimately worthwhile. I just think it's I've been up there a few times. You know, obviously I have to come up from London, and the first time I ever went there was actually 2012. So
Hmm.
I stayed at. It was my wife allowed us to have a belated honeymoon in this in the Loch Ness Lodge near Drumnadrochit.
Yeah.
And so it was very nice. I mean, to be honest, we preferred the night in the Premier Inn in Inverness the night before. They were just friendlier,
Yeah.
but still, the hotel was lovely, great view, Loch Ness Lodge, and we went around the loch and the whole thing. And to me, it just seemed, even then, it seemed that the possibility of genuine sightings was kind of crushed by the need for tourism in a way. Not that they were that the locals would fake them, so to speak. But that the way that the loch moved, it was very strange. The way the water moved on top of it. I understand there's a lot of weird currents there in the depth, and the wind, the way the wind hit it after the boats passed by. The bow wave would be there for about 5 minutes sometimes. It seemed, and it just seemed to me that this was just a very difficult place. What with tourism and the environment itself to have a sighting. Now I know there are other lochs attached to it, then Loch Lochy, Loch Oich, etc., Loch Garry as well. Is that right? What about the chances of doing some research in those places and perhaps finding something there? There have been a few reports. Is that right?
Yeah, sightings are very rare. And Loch Oich is the next loch down
Yeah.
from along the Great Glen. As you know, the lochs are just water-filled trench from a geological fissure. Then you have Loch Lochy, which is bigger than Loch Oich, but smaller than Loch Ness, and then you feed out into the sea, Loch Linney, Loch Earl.
Yeah.
Loch Garry is fed by a river further
Oh, that's
west.
an offshoot for that.
It's an
Okay.
offshoot.
Yeah.
It's not really. So I've been to Loch Oich, I've been to Loch Lochy. I've never spent much time there. The main other loch of interest to me is Loch Mora,
Yeah.
which is has the second highest reputation for monsters in Scotland. Yeah, I've been there several times. I was first there in the 1980s. I remember reading it in that logbook I just mentioned to you. Went over to Loch Mora. I was at Loch Mora just over a week ago. I took over my drone. I took my drone over to Loch Mora because the waters are more transparent. So I think I've been to drone footage. I haven't seen anything unusual. But the problem with drones is the battery life. One battery will last you 30 minutes. So you have to keep recharging them, which you can't do on site, in the electrics. But I was thinking of other ways to extend the life of these drones. But I think, because back in the early 80s, we had a chap called Sidney Wignall, who was an explorer, who went over to Loch Mora with a kind of microlight aircraft, and he took his cameraman with him and some other guys, and they said that over at the quiet end of the loch, they saw some creatures just below the water level, which looked very, to quote another person, plesiosaur-like. And it actually made the news back in the 80s, but the films have disappeared. In fact, if we could find these films, it would probably be the best evidence for lake cryptids ever, in my opinion.
Sorry to jump on you there, but this is another strange phenomenon of all the different lochs, and there's so much footage out there that just kind of disappears. And do you think that's because in days past, maybe the news featured your footage for a little while, and then you had it on the VHS tape or Super 8 back in the day or whatever it was, and people lost interest and nobody was around to collate them or buy them, and they rotted in the attic in a box or just disappeared from view. I mean, what do you think is the reason that all of this amazing footage just seems to fall by the wayside?
No, I'm sure some of it's still lying in attics somewhere. Once they've been publicised and had their day, they just go off into storage. We need
Yeah.
today, modern footage today is less likely to be lost because of the internet.
Yes.
Mobile.
Yeah.
But we've had several films taken in the 1930s. Taylor, 2 films by a guy called Malcolm. We only have one of them is now available. The other 2 have disappeared. Nothing from the 40s. There's no films taken in the 50s. The 60s we have loads of stuff. Tim Dinsdale, we still have that film. They have the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau who took a lot of film footage as well. As far as there's only one of their films that we can view on the internet, and that's Dick Rayner's 1967 footage.
Oh, the later, he thinks that they're water birds, is that right?
Yeah.
But you can't see water birds. Are they? Did you believe that they're water birds?
I've actually never formed an opinion on that picture. I mean, at the time I was seeing the monster, but I'm not. I'm gonna.
I mean, the wake is quite small, and I remember one of the things that stood out to me the first time I was up there was when it was calm, the loch, actually with the ducks and the different types of water birds there. Each one of them left quite a considerable wake. The water seemed, in its calm state anyway, to be easy. The disturbance was very notable. And I wondered from my hotel window looking, well, actually, yeah, I guess somebody who's a bit excitable could mistake that for something else. But something like him, it seems strange to me that he would have been convinced of that then and later came to the conclusion that it was water birds.
Well, back when he took it, he was a believer. Now he isn't. He's debunking it.
Yeah.
He's debunking himself. So that's the other Loch Ness Investigation Bureau films. They are actually in his possession just now.
Oh, really?
So they're just in these rusty cans of 35mm film.
And he's not planning to. Is he digitizing them or?
Some have been digitized, but I'm not sure where he's at. 6 years ago, I asked him about this, and it was an ongoing project. I still heard nothing, and I was at the Loch Ness exhibition a week or 2 ago, which run by Adrian Shine. They weren't showing me anything. So, the problem is, if you don't believe there's a monster in these footages, then you're less motivated to do anything about it.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
I heard that there was something they had of some sort of sighting on the one of the far shores, a mile away, some creature that was supposed to be sighted and in footage that they were holding. But you hear about things like this all the time. It generally tends to be a rumor.
Land sighting. That was a land sighting.
And what sighting is that? What alleged land sighting is that?
Well, it's taken in 1963, I think, that film, and it was actually taken at 2 miles away. So the very limit of the telephoto lenses, and I've never seen it. I'd like to see it, but
I mean, you'd think that would be interesting. And I'm sorry to jump on you again, but the other thing when I always joke about it sometimes when I'm feeling frustrated is the whole area to me sometimes seems like a sort of an ailing cryptozoological Coney Island. It's had its day. There's still lots of people coming, but there's not a lot of money going into the monster side of things. And you'd think it would be of interest to people, or it'd be saleable. People visiting would want to see that film, and it could be a financial benefit to the person that owns it. But nobody seems to be acting, and I never quite knew why. And we talk about the Nessie on the net cam, the Owen Fagan, and these guys are constantly reporting these blips and blobs. But how about is it Miko's camera? I don't know whose it is, but how about you move it a little closer to the loch, because obviously you're getting a lot of hits.
I think once lockdown is over, something's going to happen. I think we'll get something. I think so. You could put a camera on the Clansman Hotel and stuff like that. Yeah, be good publicity for the Clansman Hotel. There's plenty of. The Clansman Hotel is only a couple of 100 meters from the shore. So the camera currently uses must be over half a mile away.
Yeah. So it must.
We immediately get 10 times closer. So I've asked Historic Scotland if they put one in the castle, but security, But Clansman Hotel is a great place to come.
I think that
So,
is next to the Loch Ness Lodge. That's in Drumnadrochit as well, right?
Loch Ness lodges are beside Clansman Hotel.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
A series of houses, self-catering.
That's right. Now, I love the area. I love Scotland. I was there late last year actually in Galloway Forest Park for a different thing, a Bigfoot type thing, and just in the country, and somebody who comes from Wales, I recognise it as a country. It's just a beautiful, pristine place to go and visit, but especially the loch. Now, there's 31,466 lochs and lochs, allegedly in that whole area that is Scotland. And we're just talking about the itinerant Nessies in the lochs that reside around Loch Ness and Loch Morar, or are there credible reports in other lochs of some beasties?
Loch Morar is next credible.
Yeah.
In fact, some say it's more credible.
Mm.
Adrian Syme says if there is a monster anywhere, it's in Loch Morar.
Yeah.
It's been. The other ones, Loch Lochy, there was the last sighting in Oich, I think it was 2012. I haven't really heard anything recently from Loch Lochy. So if we're going to be serious about a loch, we need to hear more reports. Loch Morar is so remote and uninhabited. I suppose you'd be surprised if anyone reports anything. But the other lochs, we've had sea lochs. There's not much happening in those lochs. There's some stuff in the 1930s, Loch Neven, Loch Treg, Loch Wyke and that. The sea lochs like Loch Hale, Loch Linney, you can argue they're sea serpents. All the other lochs are so small. Loch Duik has had some stories, but again, that's a sea loch. All the other lochs tend to just be water horse traditions rather than modern stories. There's a little loch up near Loch Ness called Loch Lach, which has had most of the stories from the 1930s. That loch's it's a puddle compared to Loch Ness.
Yeah. And even Loch Ness, is not the not the biggest place in the world. I mean, I was visiting Lake Champlain back in 2018, and when I went to Loch Ness the first time, I thought it was huge. It was gigantic, but a lake that's 14 miles across and 121 miles long. It's like that's almost the distance between here and Wales in Cardiff, where I come from. So it's
harder to survey as well.
It's hard to survey, and it's not even the biggest one they have now. I know, it's not really about size; it's about availability. You mentioned that the massive eels that was detected in the eDNA study, and other people have spoken about before, clearly. And there's also, salmon runs throughout the year, or many times in the year in Loch Ness as well. I do believe there's enough food there, but do you believe that this creature is coming in and out of the loch? Is it going to the sea? I know the journey to the sea would be quite fraught with obstacles, but I do believe it is a possibility. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, we have I collated eight sightings of strange creatures in the River Ness, which connects the loch to the sea. Yeah. We had a sighting in the mid-60s of a long necked up creature heading out to the sea in the River Ness. The interesting thing about that sighting was it happened during heavy rain. Okay? So there's a theory that when you have a lot of water, rain, flooding in rivers, raising the level of the loch and the river, it basically ends fate. There's a heightened probability a creature can more likely come in than come out. I'm not sure how easy it is, how often they can leave the loch, but there's the idea that a smaller creature gets into the loch more than once and stays there, can't get back out. Because seals generally do not get back out of the loch.
Okay, they find their way
Stay
in, but
there.
they don't
They
get out
stay.
again.
They stay there for months. They start eating the salmon, and the water bearers have to dispatch them
Oh gosh.
because there's enough food for them to live there. So, I think, see, as one, I like the itinerant monster theory. I think occasionally over decades and centuries, something comes in and gets caught, trapped,
Ah.
and it just stays there.
Okay.
But what
So I
that
mean,
is another matter.
well, I suppose with the UK having actually lots of sea serpent stories around the different coasts, especially in Scotland, it would make sense that an animal seeking a new way or seeking a new food source would take advantage of a flooded situation, of high tide, so to speak, high rivers. We see that happening in other countries, where known aquatic animals like crocodiles, for instance, in Australia, when there's flooding, they move into new territory. They check it out, don't they? They
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, we're
hmm,
talking about two conditions which probably are optimal for a large creature coming in, or semi-large juvenile, and you got a salmon run, a run of adult salmon, and spate high water levels, floods.
yeah,
So I'm not saying every time that happens you have a monster coming in, but yeah, it's happened in centuries past. I don't know how long these things live, but whether
yeah.
they actually breed in the loch, I don't know.
Okay, okay. So these reports over time really could be the odd creature that gets stuck there and so it has to either wait until this flooding reoccurs or
Yeah,
stay.
well, I don't think any chance they can get out. I mean, I don't think
Yeah,
they're intelligent enough to figure that out.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
if monster doesn't think, well, there's a lot of rain, this is my chance to get back to the sea. So,
Oh, but I suppose aquatic animals would they would take advantage of the situation that's there. I guess maybe not. Yeah, maybe they wouldn't go that way. I don't know what their senses really would direct them to do if they have a pool, as it
we
were.
can
Some
see,
animals have.
yeah,
Just
navigational sense, like
yeah,
salmon.
yeah. I mean, yeah. So many animals have it that are much smaller. Just before we go, and I've really enjoyed it. I probably ask
Mm-hmm.
100 more questions. Just talk about your books. And so I want people. I've got some of these books. I really love them. I want other people to find these books. And now I've got the Water Horses of Loch Ness, and I've got When Monsters Come Ashore. But there are others as well. Tell us about the other titles.
Well, I got Water Horses Loch Ness, my first book in 2011, I think, which basically covers the folklore, the water horses, the kelpies, general folklore of aquatic monsters in Scotland. That actually parallels the increase in sightings of monsters in the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's a parallel story of legend, folklore plus real sightings.
Right.
Georgian times, Victorian times, Edwardian times, and so on. Second book, When Monsters Come Ashore. This is actually an anthology of articles, plus a few new ones on land sightings. Because land sightings is, I think, my most popular book actually. People love, for some reason, people love land sightings because it's so weird and strange and kind of close encounters of the third kind of stuff. The last book was Photograph Loch Ness Monster, which covers all the famous photographs, some of which we've talked about today, the surgeon's photograph. So it doesn't cover films; it's just still images. I haven't covered all the photographs. It goes right up to the present day, and it includes the fakers. So that's why it's subtitled "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly."
Yeah,
The good
I like
ones,
that.
the good ones, the Clint Eastwoods, which I believe are genuine. Then you have the bad ones, which are just basically misidentified
I'm
stuff.
looking at the Muppet Nessie right now in the cover.
That comes under ugly.
Ugly,
That's fakes.
Doc Shields.
So good, bad, ugly.
Yeah.
Also have a small monograph book called Dragons West of Loch Ness.
Yeah, no, that looks very interesting. But it's only Kindle, is that right?
Yeah. The other books are paper because I wanted all the online digital stuff to be put into paper form.
Yeah.
For posterity. If the website ever disappears, you still get the books. That's the whole idea.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And just for everybody out there as well, I would say, yeah, go to lochnessmystery.blogspot.com. It's a great source of everything Nessie that you could possibly want to know about. Now, and I love the tagline as well: reclaiming the Loch Ness Monster from the current tide of debunking and skepticism.
That's
If
right.
you believe there's something strange in Loch Ness, read on. Which is, that I was sold. That was.
Read it on.
I didn't even look at the price tag. I read on from there.
Yeah.
Roland, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me again. And yeah, I just can't wait to see what the future holds. And I'm holding out for some really great newsworthy snaps on your game cams. That's what I'll be thinking about later tonight. Thanks for coming
Yeah.
on.
Thank you, Andy.
Okay, bye bye.
Yeah, we're done.